Just before we start, reminding everyone that June 6th at noon Eastern or 9 a.m. Pacific time, that's 6 days from now, is when the barn raise begins. And we can start our class with the first question that was from Austin, actually, almost a week ago. And the question, Publius, is right now the way that convert works is that you lose seeds if you go from LP to beans. And also there's a chance for you to lose BDV if the BDV of the LP is below the deposit amount. Can you shed some understanding on why is it designed this way, and is there a possibility for it to be changed in the future?
Definitely. So the question on seeds is a little bit easier to answer. If Beanstalk allowed you to keep your seeds when you convert deposited LP to deposited beans, the question then becomes, well, how do you handle things when you convert back to deposited LP again? Do you get more seeds? So to some extent, the nature of the Stalk system is that there's a maximum seed per BDV, and that creates a linear growth in stock, which is essential to the long-term distribution of stock over time. And so the concept of letting people farm infinite seeds is pretty unattractive. However, the concept of, when we talk about your stock, so your stock is a function of your grown stock and the stock from your BDV. And when convert was originally introduced, there's two directions for convert. You can convert your deposited beans into deposited LP tokens, in which case there's no change in BDV at all, and so this isn't a problem. But in the case where you convert deposited LP tokens to deposited beans, the BDV is unlikely to be the same as the BDV under your deposit. And so the question is, and that's because the impermanent loss under the LP token denominated in beans in that time. And so the question is, how should the system treat this change in BDV? And when convert was originally introduced, the thought was to be conservative in the reward for converting, whereby if there was impermanent loss in bean denominated value, the thought was to have a haircut in your stock on your BDV reflect that. And that in practice did introduce some friction on the converts. When Beanstalk was back up and running, there were some people in the Discord that highlighted that they were losing stock when they were converting LP to beans. And so that's a friction point. And when you consider at the protocol level, Beanstalk wants to incentivize an efficient conversion, it does make sense to change, I would say, the policy that the protocol implements when you convert LP to beans, whereby there shouldn't be a loss in stock if there is a decrease in the bean denominated value. And so it's a less extreme incentive than allowing people to compound their seeds, if you will, but then that is a much more frictionless experience when it comes to converting in both directions. And so that, in theory, should encourage tighter peg maintenance on both sides of the peg, in this case, particularly on the downside. So this is a pretty simple change to implement and would be among the parameters that we would probably encourage being implemented upon restart. And so there's no reason why not to implement this, sooner rather than later. And so the concept is, this is a no-brainer to change sooner rather than later.
Okay. And just to help me make sure that I understood this, how are you going to stop the potential of accumulating stock? Seeds, if you keep doing that, so you keep going back and forth?
So there's no extra seeds. You still forfeit your seeds when you go from deposited LP to deposited beans. So you'll be accruing less grown stock per season. But the change that we're suggesting is purely with regards to the, not even the grown stock, just the stock for your BDV, which is 1-to-1. And so the question now here is, how do you handle the change in BDV?
Got it. And I'm guessing the reason we can't do that, where we basically stop someone from going back and forth, is because otherwise all seeds are fungible, and you'll have to differentiate between them to know which ones, went one side and coming back.
Well, there's a couple different reasons why not to do it, but the main reason is to minimize the accumulation of excess seeds per BDV. When you think about the structure of the stock system, there's a maximum seeds per BDV. So there's a maximum grown stock per BDV, and you don't want to compromise that maximum by allowing people to farm their seeds, excuse me. If you farm your stock, that doesn't compromise the seed per BDV ratio, or the grown stock per season per BDV ratio. Got
it. Okay, and Austin then follows up. What disadvantage be then if we just give 4 seeds to everyone? LP deposits, bean deposits, everyone gets 4.
So that's an interesting question. Now, in reality, holding beans and holding LP tokens have a different risk return, have a different risk profile, first off, and from Beanstalk's perspective, have different benefits to the protocol. So Beanstalk would much prefer for people to hold deposited LP tokens. Now, I think where Austin's and the reason is because it wants there to be high levels of liquidity. Now, where Austin's question seems to be coming from is the friction around people forfeiting their seeds when they convert deposited LP to deposited beans. That's okay in the sense that Beanstalk doesn't necessarily want everyone to convert at 99.999 cents. Instead, the goal is for there to be some range over which people want to convert. And so having some friction where there is a cost-benefit analysis that needs to be made on whether or not it's worth converting and forfeiting the seeds relative to the benefit from the extra beans that you get or the stock that you get from buying beans below peg. That's a friction point that at the moment I think Beanstalk is comfortable with. As the model continues to play out, that may present itself as a sore spot, but at the moment it doesn't appear to be one, and therefore hard to speculate as to you don't want to change things before they present themselves as issues per se, but that is at the margin. You could make an argument that you want to minimize the cost as much as possible while still having some marginal benefits. You could do 3 seeds and 4 seeds. You could do 3.5 seeds and 4 seeds. How does this relate to the Beanstalk gauge system? It's all unclear. So these are very good questions, and I think unclear on whether or not it makes sense to change the seed per bean deposit ratio. But at the moment, would think that that's not necessary or advantageous to the system. But perhaps we'll see how this plays out. Over the next couple months, and that may change.
Yeah, and I guess especially with the gauge system, I guess these questions are going to be more discussed once we switch. Harry Smith asks, 20% indication of interest and 10% on the wallet. Has any of that changed?
The short answer is, I think those are generally the same place we're at. I think the actual interest is probably a little higher than that, such that I think we'll probably get to 20% prior to the restart. That may be actually in day one. That may be a little ambitious. It's like but when the thing restarts, we'll be at basically 20%. But I think we'll be close to that. And, if that's the case, we'll be quite excited. In terms of money in the wallets or in bank accounts, I think we're still at 10-ish%, maybe a little bit more. Memorial Day weekend, not too much has happened.
All right. Neurovirus asks two questions. We're going to, the first one is, what do you think about the permanent deposit idea, that Sync's idea? And then the second one is, do you think an idea like that is to be implemented natively on Beanstalk or on a protocol on top of Beanstalk?
Well, the two questions go hand in hand. Ultimately, there's nothing wrong with a protocol that locks in deposits. However, at the Beanstalk level, there's not, as far as I can tell, an obvious advantage to having locked deposits. Now, I mean, maybe when you think about the liquidity that would want to leave the system in a wind down, like a true like a collapse, that if you have locked deposits, that sort of minimizes the overhang above the system. But it's like what does that even mean? It's a marginal benefit, and at the end of the day, that doesn't substantively change the economics of the protocol at all. Then the question becomes, well, why would anyone lock something in permanently? Beanstalk would have to pay them to do that. And so given that, again, as far as I can tell, or we can tell, there's no benefit to Beanstalk to having people permanently lock their deposits, or obvious benefit, it's hard to justify Beanstalk paying a premium for people to lock their deposits. Now, there's lots of different protocols that we hope will exist on top of Beanstalk. We assume many of which will have treasuries that are permanent to some extent, and therefore they may never withdraw from the silo, or they may commit to never withdrawing from the silo. But it doesn't make sense to implement that directly at the Beanstalk level, as far as we can tell.
Okay. During the discussion, Publius, and I had a few comments on it, and I described an idea of having a permanent deposit to defend PEG akin or similar to collateral. It will behave the same way a collateral behaves, and Sync's reply was that was a mischaracterization. I wanted to hear your opinion on that, or your thoughts on that. If we have a permanent deposit that's locked in the protocol and is there to defend PEG, does this not behave the same way collateral would?
Well, it's actually worse than collateral, because you have this reserve now of locked deposits that are either going to be Beans or LP tokens, and they'll be distributed. This reserve will be distributed as some percentage of deposited Beans and deposited LP tokens. When the price is too high, it'll convert, and the ratio will increase to more deposited LP tokens. And when the price is too low, the ratio will increase to deposited Beans. The problem is, when do you do that? When do you implement that? And so you would need some random, certainly pseudo-random at a minimum, but hopefully more random than that, truly such that the protocol can't be easily front-run on the converts in either direction. And that's really the problem that we see there. Now, Beanstalk, from a first principles perspective, has been designed to minimize the ease at which people can be front-run, because the protocol doesn't make any open market operations itself, other than selling Beans on the open market during a season of plenty. And it's comfortable doing that because it wants people to front-run it, meaning it will only sell Beans on the open market if no one whatsoever is willing to sell Beans. And the fact that it is going to sell Beans means that you'd expect people to front run it and sell. And so the fact that it is selling Beans means there's no sell pressure whatsoever. But other than that, Beanstalk takes no market action in any case. And the concept of having permanent deposits that are now making open market operations to keep the peg at the protocol level, that's highly, highly unattractive. At the level on top of Beanstalk, where you have independent DAOs or market participants all competing to do that against one another, that's very attractive and aligned with a competitive marketplace that would create a strong but randomly maintained peg based on supply and demand that is a little bit harder to game than per se if it was all done at the protocol level. So it's not to say that you can't do it, but to do it in a way that isn't easily gameable is very difficult.
So just to add on a few things there, number one, talking about the gameability of Convert, with kind of withdrawable deposits, there's no guarantee that the convert will even happen. Everyone who has deposited LP could withdraw at any time in sell. If we move into a world of permanent deposits, that's no longer the case. If we have permanently deposited liquidity, there's nothing it can do but convert. And therefore, it's like, everyone can operate with the assumption that all permanent LP will eventually convert. And yeah, we can try to make it random kind of at what point that convert happens, but the point is it's still guaranteed to convert. And, it's kind of hard to kind of think about whether that's gameable or not, and if that kind of, goes along with the assumptions that we've made with the current convert structure. In addition to that, having a permanently deposited bean doesn't necessarily help anyone, right? It's like if we have a permanently deposited bean, why does that even exist? Like we might as well just burn it. Like what's the point of creating supply just to lock that supply forever? And then kind of the third thing is, we already have this stock and seed system to incentivize people to deposit things for longer. And it's already intended to work such that the longer you leave something deposited, the more it costs to withdraw. So when we talk about whether we should add a permanent deposit system or not, obviously the first question is, okay, what's the additional incentive to lock up a deposit forever? And the question is, given we already have this stock and seed system with increasing opportunity cost of withdrawing, is the system willing to sacrifice any additional rewards at all in order to get someone to permanently lock their deposit forever if they're already kind of going to be incentivized to never withdraw in the long run? So just a couple of additional thoughts there.
Completely agree with the stock system. That the stock system is designed to do the same or achieve the same objective as what the permanent deposit is, trying to do. I guess lastly as well is the scalability of it. If we come to agree that a certain percent of permanent deposits is, the equilibrium point, or Beanstalk is happy with it, then how does Beanstalk scale with it? And if it doesn't scale with it, then that's an additional change that you'll want to keep looking at and try to find out some meaning of it, of what that means. All right, a question from Austin about the root token. What will the root token fit in the root ecosystem? What does it mean to hold that token, I guess?
I have no idea. Have spoken with Manifold and the root team a little bit about this. At this point in time, it's unclear exactly how the root token will function. The thing that we're pushing for, and anyone that wants to build on top of Beanstalk and wants our help, the thing that we'll push for in general is for there to be rent-free protocols built on top of Beanstalk. And so the question is, the concept of having a Uniswap token that the value is through governance and, in theory, like some future fee you could impose on the system is kind of ridiculous. You could make an argument that there's iterations of that are better, but at the end of the day, those tokens are all really worthless. And so the question is, how do you build a token to support or create or facilitate a decentralized, frictionless protocol built on top of Beanstalk? I don't necessarily have a good answer for it at the moment, but know that the root token, or the root team, I should say, they're all working pretty hard on that at the moment, and we'll be very excited to see what they all come up with. So I think it's still a little bit early on the token side. As far as I understand it, they're still implementing the rate swap stuff in Solidity, and then from there we'll focus on the token economics.
Right. A question from Terboy asking any substantive updates from the audits, any findings and changes in the timeline, I guess, from the audits.
Not to my knowledge. Publius, you want to comment?
Yeah, the Halborn audit's underway. Nothing too substantive so far that they found. They're chugging along well. Trail of Bits obviously starts a week from yesterday, so looking forward to that. We'll pretty much, we'll be able to wrap up the rest of the code changes by then, and hopefully we can tie up the code in a nice box, give it to them, and get it back as soon as possible. It's just hard to there's a lot of new code and a lot of very complicated code being added alongside the new proposal. So fingers crossed that doesn't cause any hiccups in terms of timelines and such. But the goal is to be able to get this protocol up running safely, not swiftly.
Thank you for that. A question from Bean. I guess a follow-up to the permanent deposit idea, but maybe it's a general one, is asking, would something like this be built, added as a facet to reduce gas cost, or it should be kept separate? I think this question is applicable to anything built on Beanstalk.
I think it's likely to be a separate protocol instead of a facet of Beanstalk.
Right, a question about the root raise, and the question is, who were the investors, and is this happening or not? I believe the right person to answer this would be Mr. Manifold, so reach out to him and ask that question, Turboy. The Guilfoyle asks, what are the key benefits of investing in Fertilizer now versus the silo when Beanstalk resumes?
Well, the apples to apples analysis is difficult to do before you know how much of the stock and seeds have vested. And so it's a little bit hard to model. Now, if you have no participation in the barn raise whatsoever, close to zero, which again we don't think is likely at this point, but if you have low single digit percentage participation, that is likely to basically make the silo very attractive, because there won't be a lot of stock and seeds at the moment. So each dollar of capital you add to the silo will get a significant amount of future bean mints. So how that relates to the return on fertilizer is based on a lot of different factors, including what the humidity is, including the amount of fertilizer that's sold out, including the percentage of the fertilizer that's been paid out, including the amount of stock that's been issued from vesting and from people adding to the silo. There's infinite variables, but the concept is you'd expect in an efficient market for the return in the silo and fertilizer to trend towards a similar rate of return. Now, whether or not the Beanstalk market is sufficiently efficient for that to happen, I think that we might be a little early for that, but in theory, because of their nature, you'd expect them to be somewhat similar. Now, because the silo does have liquidity, you can withdraw, whereas fertilizer, once you purchase the fertilizer, you can't unpurchase it. You can only sell it on the open market. In theory, it is a slightly different liquidity profile, so there may be some difference in the return reflected in the market because of that. But otherwise, you'd expect them to trend towards to be somewhat similar. Now, I think what's more likely to happen than not is, unless the barn raise fills very early on, the silo will become more attractive than fertilizer for a period of time until the existing fertilizer has been largely paid back. And then at that point, the fertilizer will become very attractive because you can receive a low return, but a high percentage of future bean mints. So you'll get a low return very quickly, which on an annualized basis would be still very attractive. So the thought would be that the silo would be more attractive than fertilizer in most cases. And that's by design in part. The goal would not be to have Fertilizer crowd out the attractiveness of the silo.
So to summarize this, would you say if, let's say, equal amount of money, having the ability to withdraw is not like, of concern, it would basically be the percentage of your ownership in the silo versus the percent of fertilizer that you have versus outstanding fertilizer to be paid. Is that right?
Generally, yes.
Okay. Question from Neurovirus asking do you guys have any ideas on protocols to be built on top of Beanstalk? And he's happy to build and wondering if the team is up for that. I guess Neurovirus can help build Beanstalk itself. So reach out to the team, and we'll be happy with your help on the protocol itself, and then on any ideas that comes to be built on top of it as well.
Well, we would also just add, though, it depends what your skill set is. One of the cool things about a positive carry stablecoin is that what it facilitates is potentially infinite. So the concept is it depends what your background and expertise and interest is, and then that would be the starting point for a discussion on what to build. But think that there's a wide variety of different things. In terms of early days, something like Root, where it's a rate swap, that is a basic derivative on top of Beanstalk that will facilitate more adoption of Beanstalk because people need fixed yields to facilitate other stuff. That's a very clear, obvious first use protocol to build on top of Beanstalk. There's lots of other derivatives and financial products that also make sense to build on top of Beanstalk in a decentralized fashion. But beyond that, the goal would be to start to build an entire economy of products on top of a positive carry stablecoin. So what does that consist of? There's infinite things that need to be filled in terms of on-ramps, wallets, credit cards, debit cards. There's infinite parts of the Beanstalk economy that can hopefully get built. So we would highly encourage you, if you're serious about that, to reach out. Maybe we should hop on a call and just shoot some shit and brainstorm. And that applies to anyone else that also wants to build on top of Beanstalk. We love it.
And I guess you can also add a positive carry currency, or even just a decentralized currency as well. Okay, I see a few typing. Sync asks, the custom guarding of Beanstalk NFT by the Idols team, will that be rewarded to an early participant in the barn raise? Or any idea what qualifies that?
I have no idea on that one, Sync.
Yeah, undecided, Sync. The team hasn't come to a conclusion on how to use that NFT, but welcome to ideas as well on how we think is best to make use of it. Okay, this is the end of the questions. Maybe we can give it a minute, see if we got more. See Dumpling typing. Seems like a long question. So Dumpling is following up on the what can be built on top of Beanstalk. What ideas? Can you elaborate a bit on? You've mentioned a few things like financial derivatives. Maybe Publius, can you elaborate a bit on what could be built on top of Beanstalk?
So the first things that come to mind that are kind of basic are things to improve the user experience around Beanstalk. So the variable or constantly changing rate of being in the silo, that's potentially a user experience issue which root solves. Another user experience issue is the need to constantly farm your grown assets. That is another functionality that can be built on top of Beanstalk to be automated in some fashion. Now there's complexity associated with that, and to some extent, a protocol like Root may offer those functionalities because it facilitates more participation in the Root protocol. But in general, some sort of auto farming feature. When you think about what are the other UX issues with Beanstalk right now, when you have the soil wars, there's smaller farmers find it impossible to participate in lending to the protocol. You could, in theory, have a protocol that facilitates people to load up a bot with soil and then group things together and collectively try to buy soil. Those are just like very basic things to improve user experience. Then when it comes to, one of the things that we're trying to work on to facilitate cool stuff is like a silo interface. So one of the most difficult things about Beanstalk is that deposits are non-fungible and totally don't follow any sort of standard. And therefore, facilitating the easy interaction between protocols like Root and Beanstalk the friction around that can be significantly lessened if there's a silo interface being implemented. So I know Publius has been working with the Root team on that interface because Root would hopefully be the proof of concept of something like that. The concept of a pooled convert, I see Bernoulli Bean shouting that out, a la what we were just talking about. It's not a permanent deposit or something like that or a reserve, but a protocol built on top of Beanstalk to just convert. The only issue with that is, again, doing that in an autonomous fashion. There you do need some sort of like management, so that wouldn't necessarily be autonomous, but that's another thing. One of the difficult things is timing. So Ethereum is at the very beginning of its scaling journey, if you will. And at the moment, it's a little bit more difficult to implement certain protocols on Ethereum itself, particularly order book-based protocols. And so when you think about all the derivatives that you want to be supported within the silo, such that people can basically buy and sell calls and puts on silo yield, for example, that may be a little bit further into the future because of the desire for order books to facilitate that stuff. But there's so many different things that you can build on top of Beanstalk. We've talked about a zero-fee DEX because of Beanstalk's ability to attract liquidity. There's so many fucking cool things you can build. So just if anything, the really big ones, you don't even want to like Mirror Protocol. That's been in the news over the past 24 hours. All sorts of cool stuff you can build on top of Beanstalk. You wouldn't want to implement Mirror until it's back to being fully decentralized, but in the future, everything is possible.
I'd like to follow up with the Mirror comment there, and I guess this is a different question. Do you see a world where Beanstalk issues different, like right now we have Bean, pegged to the USD, so we'll have other assets pegged to other things. Would that utilize the same field or podline, or would those be different since, each asset has its own creditors, I guess?
So the assets would be, I mean, there's different ways you can do it. If there's a different pod line, then it's really a different Beanstalk. So at the end of the day, you'd expect there to be one pod line, but multiple assets that you can lend to Beanstalk. And then the soil would be priced in one of the assets per se, and then there'd be a ratio based on the asset that you lend to Beanstalk. But in theory, when you have Beanstalk issuing other assets, there are some technical friction points from an economics perspective haven't really worked through. So while I'm sure it is possible to implement, haven't necessarily gotten to the end of that one there. So that'll be a problem to work on in a couple months, hopefully.
Yeah. All right, a question from Austin, and he's following up on a thread that I think was by Mooj or Moog. I'm not quite familiar with it, so let me read the question from Austin. And he's asking, what does Beanstalk look at scale? In a situation where there's minimal demand for beans, so we've plateaued basically, and we've approached the total addressable market. What happens then? Is it difficult to reason about what happens in that type of situation in theory? And in many ways, we can only learn in practice by doing it.
Well, there's a lot of different questions that were asked in that thread. Frankly, it's hard to address all of them because it's a little bit all over the place. We tried to do some of it in writing within the thread itself. But to answer Austin's question on a steady state, where Beanstalk is at scale, there's no expectation of future growth from Beanstalk growing to fill its market, and it's now the main stablecoin issuer or money issuer perhaps in the world. That's really what scale would look like, where beans with some denomination are the main currency used in the world. That would be what scale looks like. And the question is, in a situation where there's minimal demand for beans, I think it's probably better worded as minimal growth in demand for beans expected, such that the reasonableness of lending to Beanstalk may come into question. Well, there's a couple things to be said there. One, the protocol has, at any given time, a current supply and an outstanding amount of pods. And whereas at the moment there's a third distribution to stockholders, pod holders, and fertilizer holders, normally it's 50-50. But regardless, at any time that you're lending to Beanstalk, you can calculate the bean supply at which your pods will harvest. And in reality, though, so it's presented as you can always, assuming that Beanstalk grows to that size, you can always, what your return is. You're locking in your return. And then the question is, well, will the bean supply grow to that size? Now the question is, you're at a steady state where the bean supply is not expected to grow. What does lending to Beanstalk look like? So the starting point is, what is the pod rate? So if Beanstalk has a pod rate that is high, whatever that means, Beanstalk defines the excessively high pod rate as 35%. So let's say the pod rate is high. There may be nobody that's willing to lend to Beanstalk, because at a 50-50 split, in order to get paid back, there's too much growth factored in. And this is one of the reasons why Beanstalk optimizes around the pod rate in addition to the price. So instead, however, if we assume Beanstalk is at an optimal pod rate, call it 15%, which is what is currently defined as the optimal pod rate, then the question is, well, the bean supply needs to grow 30% in order for your pods to get paid back. Or, and this is where things it is a little bit of a technicality, but when we're talking about the steady state, how things work, so this is a detail we haven't typically gotten into. The calculus on what bean supply you'll get paid back at is actually a maximum. So it's what is the maximum bean supply at which you will get paid back at. But it could be less than that because beans are constantly being lent to Beanstalk. And so there's actually a constant decrease in supply and then an increase in supply. If you're in the steady state, in theory, the bean supply is remaining constant, but the pod line should actually be churning. And so then the question is just, how quickly would I expect 30% of the bean supply to be churned through entirely? Now, the nature of bean mints, and I'm thinking out loud here, where only half of bean mints go to paying off debt, makes it such that it's unclear if you have oscillations above and below the peg, how the pod rate will grow, if that makes sense. So if you're at the steady state, the question is, how do you make sure that the pod rate doesn't grow? And this is where the community's had some great feedback on, even under the current soil parameters after BIP 9, there's probably an additional efficiency that can be introduced such that the pod line doesn't just stay fixed in length, it actually decreases when the price is above $1. So that would exacerbate the rate at which the pod line is being cycled through, if you will, and minimize the percentage of the bean supply that needs to be cycled through in order to get paid back. But the concept is, at a steady state, assuming that there's an economy on top of Beanstalk where there's capital flowing in and out, you would actually expect over time for your loan to still be paid back by Beanstalk. And even if, and again, this is all presuming that there's no growth in bean demand, which is an assumption I'm not necessarily willing to grant, but this is arguing against a steelman argument where there is no bean growth. I think there is still a steady state where lending to the protocol is attractive. And the system can continue in perpetuity. Now, there's a separate question as to how would Beanstalk respond when you have a significant decrease in demand for beans. But in reality, all that would be is an increase in the pod rate if you assume Beanstalk is functioning, such that now you have a decrease in demand and now you're in a steady state. The same questions we were just asking before apply, but at a slightly higher pod rate. So there's the same question of sustainability. Obviously, if there's too much of a decrease in demand, such that the pod rate increases dramatically, at some point you may have an inability to attract lenders. But we would comment that the convert functionality is in practice likely to greatly minimize the amount of debt the protocol actually needs to issue, even if you have a decrease in demand for beans. Now, the interesting thing to say, though, is when we say decrease in demand for beans, it's kind of funky because if someone's converting, they're actually buying the beans back. And so net, there isn't a decrease in demand for beans. Whereas what we're saying colloquially is people are selling their beans. So in the context that there are some silo members that continue to believe in the future growth of Beanstalk, they can stack their beans in stock, which in theory is negating the sell pressure in beans and reducing the amount of total decrease in demand. When you have actual decreases in demand, that's where you would expect it to be reflected in the increase in the pod rate. So substantively, again, it's very clear how this gets out of hand and Beanstalk potentially is unable to attract lenders, where you have too much of a decrease in real demand, independent of convert, such that the protocol needs to issue too much demand, and it goes from having a healthy debt level to a very unhealthy debt level, and in doing so makes it unattractive to lend to the protocol at a steady state. Now, I do just want to make the argument, and this is now having gone through the whole premise of there is no increase in demand for beans, and this does speak to Vitalik's point in his article that it's an unreasonable assumption that stability or any protocol is built on perpetual growth. And so to that point, it is very important that Beanstalk is able to function in perpetuity in a lot of cases without increased demand for beans. We would make the argument that if Beanstalk is creating a stable asset, that apples to apples, there will be increases in demand for that asset. Now, whether that's true or not remains to be seen. It's hopefully non-substantive as to whether Beanstalk can work. In reality, it probably is substantive as to whether Beanstalk can work. And so the question is, once the protocol faces long-run decreases in demand, assuming the protocol is able to return the bean price to a stable level, even if the pod rate has increased, will there be new demand to enter the system, given that the Beanstalk has demonstrated its stability? And unclear. If anything, that's a behavioral question. So I just want to shout out Moog for raising their points. Their tone was perhaps not the most appropriate, but it's funny. You click on their bio, they go to UChicago, and it's like, yeah, exactly like all the other people we went to school with. So we're used to the tone. We don't mind it per se, but would appreciate everyone to perhaps engage with a little bit more friendly discourse in mind as we're all trying our best here. But nonetheless, the skepticism is very healthy, and we think it's fabulous that people are pointing out any and all potential issues with Beanstalk. And we invited them to class. They said they had a conflict, but hopefully they'll be here next week and we can talk about this further.
Publius, I wanted to touch a bit about the steady state scenario that you've described. So we're talking that Beanstalk isn't growing anymore, and growth in general can come from two ways: either by you're capturing more market share, or the market size itself is growing. And in your example, we said that Beanstalk now is like the number one issuer, or the major issuer. So you're not taking market share anymore, and now we're questioning if the market itself is growing or not. Is it reasonable to think that the market won't grow anymore? This is equal to saying that DeFi is not growing anymore, or the economy is not growing anymore. And while that might happen and it might stagnate, but it won't happen forever, right? So is it unreasonable to start from the very beginning and say that there's not going to be demand anymore?
Well, that is kind of the substantive point, right? At scale, if Beanstalk continues to be able to maintain its issued stablecoins at their pegs, it's hard to imagine that there won't be increased demand for stable assets when the rest of the market is collapsing, right? So in practice, and this is where Convert is so powerful, if you are risk off in this environment where the whole market is shrinking, the stable asset is going to be whatever Beanstalk issues. And so in practice, the conservative play will be to convert your LP to beans when the prices are too low. And the prices being too low will be in practice manifested by the decrease in value in these other assets, right? So if you have a general sell-off in the market, de facto beans will be below peg and people will need to convert their LP tokens to beans. That behavior is exactly aligned with what you'd want to take place in the case where people are using Beanstalk as a reserve, or beans as a reserve asset, perhaps, or a store of value in that instance. So, and in particular, accruing stock during that period of time is also something that's attractive if you think Beanstalk as a protocol will continue to function. So, yeah, again, this is all kind of presuming that the protocol works, and then people are comfortable with the volatility in the bean price, because they generally have confidence that it will continue to oscillate above and below its peg. But assuming that's the case, it isn't unreasonable to expect Beanstalk to actually perform quite well if the rest of the economy shrunk.
Yeah. And I guess the point is, even if economies shrink, eventually you'd expect them to grow in the long run or in the long term. A question from Alex says, FRAX has been making waves lately with interesting developments. I guess maybe he's talking about the base pool that Breen mentioned earlier, which was FRAX USDC, I think. And they said, participants there are going to get some rewards. So what are your thoughts on that and on FRAX in general?
So I haven't spent too much time on FRAX over the past couple of weeks. We did see that after Terra collapsed, they indicated they were inclined to change to a credit-based model, which to us is very exciting. It's a recognition that partial collateralization doesn't work on chain, and the only way to do partial collateralization is, in fact, not to have protocol native collateral serve as the remaining piece, but to have credit, outstanding obligations from other protocols. And so to that end, we've actually approached them to try to participate in the barn raise at the protocol level as sort of a proof of concept that FRAX can start backing some of their non-collateralized USDC collateralized portion with debt and Beanstalk debt in that case. There was a draft of a FRAX governance proposal dropped a couple days ago in their forum. Hopefully there will be a snapshot actually for them to vote on in the not too distant future to maybe participate. But the concept is, the only real issue that we see with FRAX, and it's hard to ignore, is to use USDC. And so there is this kind of gun to their head at all times that makes it very difficult if decentralization is a priority to rely on FRAX, because they rely on USDC and you can't rely on USDC. So their move to to using debt or exogenous debt to back FRAX, that's very cool. And we hope they start to lend to Beanstalk at the protocol level. But beyond that, don't find it with the USDC gun to the head it's very hard to get past that.
Question from Sync about using Aztec as a network 2 or an L2 solution. So Aztec, I think that was John Woo's project, or he mentioned it, and the advantage of it is batching transactions, basically.
So yeah, we had a great Twitter Spaces with John Woo. Aztec is really cool. We are big believers in the potential of zero-knowledge proofs, and in particular their application on Ethereum. We also really like that Aztec is like zero-knowledge first, and is kind of focused on building things out slowly, but all zero-knowledge. And so the question would be more, when are they ready for Beanstalk, if you will? But in theory, Aztec's very cool.
Austin followed up on the idea of reducing the pod line, and I wanted to touch a bit on that. Wouldn't that be the same as austerity, where we're sacrificing growth, for reducing that? As long as we maintain a certain pod rate or a pod, why would we want to reduce our debt?
Well, the short answer is Beanstalk. There's a couple different cases, right? And you make a good point, which is that Beanstalk really cares about its pod rate. So if the pod rate is below the minimum pod rate, wherever debt is considered excessively low, in theory, it would make sense for Beanstalk to offer debt up to that minimum, because Beanstalk always wants to be at that minimum. Now, above that, there's a question of when the price is above 1 and Beanstalk is minting beans, under the current parameters, the pod line doesn't change length. And so the pod rate can decrease, but the pod line stays fixed. Now, the maybe I wasn't sufficiently articulate, but the suggestion is to have the pod line decrease in addition to the pod rate decreasing, such that the pod rate decreases faster in certain instances, But where we think it's more substantive is where you have a steady state where when the price is above 1, the pod line decreases, and then when the price is below 1, the pod rate increases again. And that's where you can have a more sustainable outstanding debt level with a sustainable or a stable supply of beans.
Okay, thank you, and I like this idea. So we're basically saying maintain the pod line at a specific pod rate, and when it's above that, reduce the pod line to accelerate the pod rate reduction, basically. Okay, Austin has dreams about Convert. I think we reached to the end of the questions, unless I missed someone's question.
This was a fun class.
I enjoyed it. I mean, every class is. Okay, I think this is the end of the questions, or the last of them, at least for this week. Publius, thank you for making class, for taking all the questions, I guess, and see you next week.
Awesome.
Thank you. Before that, thank you. And once again, 6 days to go, June 6th. The barn raise is at noon Eastern or 9 a.m. Pacific time. Thank you, everyone.